Hello and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jennifer Yee, and I am the Director of Public Programs here at the Guggenheim, New York. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation with the artist Rashid Johnson and curator Naomi Beckwith, presented on the occasion of the magnificent exhibition, Rashid Johnson, A Poem for Deep Thinkers. As a representative of the Education and Public Engagement Department at the museum, a belief at the core of our approach is that artists are our partners in education. As such, it is always a joy to offer opportunities to hear directly from artists about the exhibitions and artworks we have on display. This would not be possible without the generous support of Elaine Turner Cooper, and we extend our gratitude to her family for endowing the Conversations with Contemporary Artists series, of which this program is a part of. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Naomi Beckwith and Rashid Johnson. Naomi Beckwith is the Deputy Director and Jennifer and David Stockman Chief Curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Foundation. In this role, she oversees collections, exhibitions, publications, curatorial programs, and archives, and provides strategic direction within the international network of affiliate museums. Beckwith has held previous curatorial posts at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. Her acclaimed exhibitions and publications have centered on the impact of identity and the resonance of Black culture on multidisciplinary practice within global contemporary art. A respected scholar and art historian, Beckwith has contributed to numerous catalog publications and periodicals. She was awarded the 2024 David C. Driscoll Prize in African American Art and Art History by the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. She is currently Artistic Director for the curatorial team implementing the Fall 2025 exhibitions at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. Beckwith is also the Documenta 16 Artistic Director. Rashid Johnson was born in Chicago and received a BFA in photography from Columbia College, Chicago, and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His work has been featured in solo presentations at a number of institutions, including the Indianapolis Museum of Contemporary Art, Sculpture Center in New York, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Miami Art Museum, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Lismore Castle Arts in Lismore, Ireland, the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art, Kansas City, and the Moderna Museet in Stockholm. The Guggenheim, New York's current exhibition, A Poem for Deep Thinkers, is the artist's largest exhibition to date, bringing together more than 90 artworks. The survey spans pivotal phases of Johnson's career, including notable series such as the New Negro Escapist Social and Athletic Club, Cosmic Slops, Black Soap shelf paintings, spray-painted text works, and more recent Anxious Men and Broken Men series, as well as large-scale indoor and outdoor sculptures. The exhibition presents Johnson's artistic evolution across nearly 3 decades, beginning with his early explorations in photography, video, and installations, and extending to his recent ventures in materially hybrid paintings and assemblages. I would be remiss if I did not also share that A Poem for Deep Thinkers is accompanied by a performance and public engagement program that takes place every Friday through Monday for the run of the exhibition. Developed in collaboration with existing and new community partners, these events will animate the 2 works that bookend the exhibition, entitled Rotunda Stage and Sanguine, bringing the installation to life as a place for creative expression, including spoken word, music, and live arts. We will hear about this and much more in tonight's discussion, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rashid and Naomi to the stage, and I will pass the mic to these 2 deep thinkers.
I thought you were going to leave me solo for a moment.
Thought about it.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. It's a beautiful day, so I know there are marvelous things that you could be doing in New York besides listening to us yammer on. But I'm so happy that you joined us this evening. And it is always, of course, a pleasure to be here amongst an amazing team at the Guggenheim, but even a bigger pleasure to have been the curator of Rashid's large survey right now. And I have to actually start off by thanking you, Rashid, for selecting the Guggenheim for what is an historic presentation, and one that not only runs through your practice, but one that I would say has returned the Guggenheim to form, as you can see in these images, because it is also an exhibition that dances with the building. One that really allows the kind of life and vivacity that Frank Lloyd Wright always wanted in his architecture to come alive, quite literally, both with the artworks, but also with this inclusion of these beautiful plants and this amazing installation called Sanguine that kind of caps off the exhibition on the top floor. So thank you for that. I wanted to begin this evening really going back to beginnings. I love origin stories. I'm sure the audience would love to hear a little bit about this as well. And I noticed that there is a work in the exhibition. It is not necessarily an early work. It's only about 10 years old, called Falling Man, a work that uses some of your signature materials that we'll get into in a moment, a work that even is a kind of quotation of Georg Baselitz's work. But for me, the most interesting thing about this object is this detail that is a portrait of your father. And so I'd love to start a little bit with your parents, maybe, your home life. What was the sort of milieu, culturally maybe, that you've been raised in that kind of got you to art and thinking about art?
No, great place to start. I'd like to, of course, thank the Guggenheim for the opportunity. It's an incredible venue, an incredible space, and it's brought alongside it an incredible audience for my project. And so I'm very proud to be here in this building, and of course, even more proud to be with my friend Naomi, as she has taken the reins of the kind of curatorial positioning of this storied museum. And I'm very proud to be one of her first major exhibitions in the building. To kind of start where Naomi suggested in my family life, I come from a family that's, not unlike your families necessarily. My mother is an academic, and she taught for many years at Northwestern University. She went on at a different stage to be the head of the history department at Loyola University, and then got into administrative positions in colleges. So I grew up in a really kind of fluid space around history. Academic and critical concerns were really present in my mom's collection of books. We had, really robust kind of library of scary titles of things that, I've spoken about this previously, but, some of those titles were quite intimidating for a young person. And I oftentimes thought of those books as objects, and you can see throughout the course of the exhibition my employment of books kind of consistently, but you see them often repeated. And that repetition is really to suggest the intentionality of their employment and the real specificity with how they were chosen, as opposed to thinking of things as found objects. I really wanted to put an emphasis on the fact that these objects are so consistently in my project chosen. And so I'm less invested in the idea of a foundness and definitely more invested in concern with how one searches for things and then gives those things agency in their project. This particular work and this image is of my father, and it's my father the year that I was born, 1977. And we're only seeing a small detail of it, but what's really quite interesting about it, and I think it actually comes back throughout the practice, like many things as a signifier consistently, is that he's sitting quite proud in a karate gi, but the belt that he has is a green belt. And for anyone who is familiar with martial arts, that is not one of the more resolved positions one would have in the martial arts. And so to see this kind of image of this man kind of like with so much pride with this green belt, and then some of the other signifiers and some of the other things that you find behind him, which are copies of the autobiography of Malcolm X, books on signs and symbols. So it's kind of a small window into the hybridity of my early childhood experience, which was kind of a mix of martial arts, Afrocentrism, academia, critical engagement and thought, and folks who were navigating all of those tools in a world that was like kind of, on the heels of the civil rights movement, but also in the heart of the anti-apartheid movement. So there's a sense of activism and action that is really present in my childhood.
Yeah, one of the joys of doing this show is actually that what you describe is basically Black Chicago in the 70s and into the 80s. And it was lovely to kind of walk through that history. That was also my own history growing up as well. Your parents were both at the opening, walking through this kind of evolution, these critical ideas. My mom is here as well and walked with me through these things as well. So it's amazing to be in this position as an artist, kind of looking back on that moment and trying to imagine what you can glean from it and then what can push forward. I want to turn a little bit to your education, formal education, because I do know that when you were in school in the 90s, there was one thing that people were obsessed with, and that was the 19th century, right? The critical read of that moment was all about looking at the 19th century as a moment where we in the West defined the world. We came up with academic disciplines. We came up with a name for everything. We sort of began to divide the world into these very strict categories. And so in university, there was a lot of critical look at like that 19th century moment and ways that we could sort of break it apart. And I always sort of looked at your early work, but tell me if I'm wrong, as almost a response to that interest in the 19th century. Because you started with these amazing images made in this technique from that century, the Van Dyke Brown technique. But tell me if I'm wrong in sort of thinking about this as a kind of response to maybe some of those critical concerns.
No, I don't think that you're wrong in reading it that way at all. It's definitely taking into consideration some of that emphasis and some of the enthusiasm for how 19th century becomes this kind of this well of ideas that we celebrate. But specifically, when I started to make these works, which I originally showed at a gallery in Chicago, and then were the works that I included in my first exhibition in New York at the Studio Museum in Harlem, in an exhibition curated by Thelma Golden called Freestyle, which was kind of an introduction for me to the art world and to the New York institutional world. These photographs were, originally kind of conjured when I was, quite young. I was 19 and 20 when I started making these, and I was kind of running into men on the street. I was at the time living in downtown Chicago. I had moved from my home in Evanston, Illinois, which was, anybody's familiar with, it's quite close. It wasn't like that big of a leap. But I was surrounded by these men who were unhoused, and they were just kind of very present around the campus of the university, and I started to photograph them. I started to bring them into these studios and, kind of actively engage and just kind of really explore a certain kind of curiosity around what is also connected to a 19th century kind of history of how people think about class distinction and how people think about how you represent certain class distinctions. And the thing that was, to kind of pivot a little, that was most complicated about this work for me was that, as much as I saw a kinship with the men that I was photographing, being that, the gross majority of them are, I think for the most part, all of them were African American. So of course we shared that characteristic, but outside of that one kind of singular characteristic that we shared, I was a child of academics. My father had a small business. We were under-resourced. We had some version of resource that kept us from hunger.
But only just.
Yeah, but there weren't vacations, that didn't include cars, at least. But when I originally, was showing these photographs, which I thought created a real kind of gap or distinction between myself and the folks that I was portraiting, and the intention of were to express a certain kind of empathy and wherewithal and embrace of these folks to whom I imagined there was kind of a disconnect between my experience and theirs. What I kind of realized quickly in the process of how these works were unpacked by the audience was that the only characteristic that they differentiated or that they recognized was the connection, the racial connection. And so there was what I expected to have a certain amount of critique attached to it, especially, in school where, there was a lot of kind of critical kind of response and a lot of kind of aggressive kind of critique when people were to take on class distinctions and what have you. But they were like wholly embraced as if, these were, my brothers.
It was a kind of psychological self-portrait, maybe?
It was, and you know what? I learned a lot from the failure to kind of critique the relationship that I had built. And I kind of recognized at that point that Blackness as a kind of succinct position was far broader reaching and far more substantive in the minds of people who came to these works and others than any other potential characteristic. And so kind of unpacking that in my life as an artist at an early stage leads to a number of bodies of work that really allow me to start to define my location more significantly than I had originally imagined I would have to. So it leads into things that we'll talk about where I say, okay, I have to define my place. I have to very much locate how it is I want to be read and understood and how I navigate and explore the kind of opportunities and obstacles of the position of being a young Black male, growing up in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s with a certain amount of privilege, but a certain amount of kind of realistic obstacle, again, against the backdrop of the post-civil rights movement. So that body of work was really significant in me exploring those themes.
But you also come to it with a kind of cheekiness. So as much as you are, almost sincerely talking about locating yourself, in many ways, there's a way in which you're kind of contending tongue-in-cheek with these historic figures. So I love, this series or this self-portrait, but it also feels very attached to the series that follows, which is the New Negro Escapist and Social Club. And I'm interested in another thing that began to happen in the 90s and has carried on even with some of your peers, which is the turn toward fiction. And using these kind of elaborate stories, these elaborate scenarios that have been created as the conceptual basis for an entire body of work. So I'm thinking of someone like Saya Woolfolk, who has a show up right now at the Museum of Arts and Design. She's created an entire world around these kind of alien creatures called the empaths. And it's still productive for her. And you had your moment sort of doing that as well, creating this New Negro Escapist and Social Club. So what was that? By the way, I never asked you that outright. Who were these folks? Who were the members of this club?
No, it's really interesting. I'm glad that you kind of recognize Saya's work in that too. We actually dated in grad school, so maybe they're...
And both are happily married, okay.
Very happily married and good friends, and I'm a fan of her project as well. And there are a number of artists I think that we could talk about in that vein. But in particular, kind of coming out, you mentioning the humor, right? So kind of coming on the heels of that previous body of work, which I called Seeing in the Dark, which were, of course, those portraits of the men, and then thinking about how those were received, and then trying to establish a way to define myself more specifically, and with a certain humor, a certain transgression, and a certain kind of clarity and honesty, you come into self-portrait with my hair parted like Frederick Douglass, which kind of takes on the absurd conceit that somehow if I parted my hair like Frederick Douglass, that I would be able to, in some ways, mimic or contribute to the world in ways that he had. And Douglass, interestingly enough, is the most photographed man of the 19th century, to bring back that idea of the 19th century. And so Douglass was very much aware of the power of images and the power of representation. So kind of stepping on his shoulders to think about that idea of representation, but then going kind of further into this group that I call the New Negro Escapist Social and Athletic Club, and thinking about fiction and kind of the value of fiction. And I think it played, for me, a couple of different roles. One was to kind of establish a series of photographs that kind of took away the possibility of imagining these Black characters as being without agency. So I wanted to kind of create or conjure this group of Black characters that you could imagine as being in some ways privileged, in some ways engaged in opportunity, but also, kind of very aware of their dandyism and their style, like really in the context of what traditionally they used to call race men, right? Which is like the Du Boisian, Booker T. Washington-like characters, these kind of polarizing, thoughtful academics whose ambition was to kind of cater to and prioritize language and approaches to navigate the complexity of the Black experience coming out of the deconstructed South. And
Basically, they were going to outthink racism.
right. Yeah. And so there's these critical spaces. And so I kind of wanted to in some ways, kind of create that fictional space, and I think that there are spaces to which this level of discourse exists, but it was more interesting for me to create it as a space of fiction that kind of hybridized where we were, where we are, thinking about the past, bringing it into a space of kind of some sort of like recontextualized future. But simultaneously, the thing that I think really also helped facilitate me making these works is that I was coming out of a background as a picture maker and thinking a lot about photography, and have been introduced to the world more as a picture maker, even though a lot of my instincts were much more akin to mark making, sculpture, conceptual practice, filmmaking. I was thinking a lot of what at the time we started to kind of call the 4D space, which was like this space of the undefined, and Rosalind Krauss goes on to call this the post-medium condition. And I oftentimes say I suffer from this condition, the condition of not necessarily having an investment in medium specificity, like a willingness to just use whatever is at my disposal and to take on different materials, different approaches, whether that's through abstraction, our conceptual practice, our, again, cinematic practices or what have you. But what I really wanted to be able to do with this body of work, I think, is to, if I created this fictional society, then they needed things. So I made the photographs, and those were representations, but they needed objects. And so it kind of led me into, what you'll see in the exhibition, or hopefully some of you have already seen in the exhibition, which are these shelves, and they're kind of covered with material and ideas, and they become very much these kind of vehicles that were meant to be employed or used by these folks in this secret society. So really, if I'm being honest, and I want to be honest with you guys because I think that that's what I'm here to do, I needed an out. I needed a way to pivot into the kind of object making and the kind of critical and material investment and interest that I wanted to explore. And this just gave me a way. And so artists are oftentimes, and you'll see this in my practice, but you'll see it in many others, are trying to solve for this big, bold question of how do I amplify my ideas? It's really, in the end, it's just the big question is, how the hell do I say all of the things that I want to say, through this process? And for me, that is really at the heart of what it is I do, is that I'm really kind of conscious of how my experience feels not special, but authentic to how, and in the way that I feel like I have seen the world, some of my exposure, some of the things that I'm intrigued by, some of the hybridities of my experience. My stepfather's Nigerian, my mother's African American, my father's an atheist. We're Catholics, like all the shit. It just, I just feel like my whole thing doesn't really make a ton of sense necessarily. So I want
It is
to
what it is.
I want to ball it up, and I want to deliver it to you so that you can see it and tell me that I'm okay to some degree, right? I'm like asking for, I don't know, acceptance or forgiveness. And so this opportunity to be vulnerable through like all of this kind of creolized kind of exposure, like here's all of this stuff. And so, to your point, this opened some of those gates and doors for me.
That was succinct. It's interesting. But for me, I think the way that you found your way out was also by a method of quotation, one of the ways out. And I like the way you just phrased that, because you hadn't actually put it to me so clearly before, which was doing these works, creating sculptures and installations that often look to several figures. And I'm actually always impressed by your sort of hybridized mind. I think of it very much as a kind of, I don't know, product of the hip hop generation. There's a lot of montage and sampling. You pull a beat from here and a rhythm from there and lyrics from here. And it feels like some of your works do that work. So I'm interested in a work like this, which very much announces itself as an homage to Chinua Achebe, but also Fela Kuti in the title. But it's a work where you're dropping things from a great height, which is also a quote of Marcel Duchamp. And then to boot, when I look at a sled, I can't help but to think of Joseph Beuys. So all these references are starting to mix themselves together in your work, and so that you actually make it okay to make all these citations and sort of synthesize them in an object, for instance, like this, which is a nod to Public Enemy, but kind of a nod to graphic design, a nod to violence, but also a nod to seeing, which was already in your earliest work. Does that feel sort of accurate to say that you found your way out through this kind of hybrid object making?
No, absolutely. I think, to your point, it was very much about how do I kind of contextualize all of these things that are being either fed to me or that were fed to me earlier and that I kind of learned on my own. And I think your reference to hip hop and mixing and kind of how the kind of collage of ideas begin to function. Alex, who works for me, always says that creativity is, and she probably stole it from somewhere, I don't know. But it's the ability to put together disparate and disconnected things and somehow make those disconnected things sing together in chorus. And so I think I've always really taken that at the heart of my project. So, you know, to your point, I mean, of course, something like Black Steel and the Hour of Chaos is a reference to Public Enemy, which, you know, I mentioned the other day, was a huge influence on me early. And that kind of leads to me thinking about Spike Lee and thinking about, you know, films like Do the Right Thing, and how do I kind of bring all of that into play? But at the same time, how do I bring in my interest in Jasper Johns to play, you know? Because I'd become obsessed around this time with a film called Painter's Painting. And so I would watch Painter's Painting and just how wildly inarticulate some of these guys were. And, you know, I don't think
Big
I've
dumb
ever really
painters. That's
said
what basically the phrase came out of that film.
Just like these dumb painters. You see like Frank Stella sitting, he's like, I didn't like second generation abstract painters. They fiddled around in the corners. And I remember thinking, this is fucking bizarre because I'm in here studying Derrida and like reading Deleuze and Guattari, A Thousand Plateaus, right? Like what happened to us, right? Like, what happened to art where, like, all of a sudden, like, all of my quotations are somehow invested in, like, Heidegger and other deconstructive positions, and these guys are talking about fiddling around in the corner. And so, you know, and that kind of leads to, like, how the project continues to evolve, because it says to itself, don't lose poetry, right? Don't allow, you know, the education and the formula of how we've you know, started to train our kind of creative thinkers. Don't allow them to sanitize your approach. And so I kind of continue, like, leading into something like this to then say, okay, how do I make sure that mark making, poetry, you know, disparate, disconnected things, materials, signifiers, have as much agency, right, in my project as the reference points, whether it's Chinua Achebe and Things Fall Apart, whether it's Du Bois, or whether it's Fanon, or, you know, any number of characters. Like, make sure that they are singing in concert with your body, in your hand, and kind of the soul of the project. And so that kind of duality, or that multiplicity, then becomes the driving spirit in a lot of ways. So both the reference, being able to partner with the poetic.
The poetic and the material too, and I think a lot of your gift has also been to synthesize, to go back to Alex's point, is synthesize these things into materials. So I'm fascinated by the use of, let's say, black soap in a painting like this, and you often talk about a real turning point for yourself. Being your work, this video, me, Tavis Smiley, and Shea Butter, shea butter being really the operative material there. So I think this represents almost another out for you. The ways in which you can also turn toward a kind of domestic material life, the life of self-care, the life of the bodily, as a way into a new way of working.
Yeah, I mean, real action. I was, at this time, I was in graduate school. I had shown my work previous to grad school, and I'd done Freestyle, the exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and I was exhibiting around Chicago, as well as, you know, some smaller venues in New York. But at one point, I decided I should go back to graduate school. It was the early 2000s. Nobody was buying my things, and I needed space to continue to work. And when I made this film, I was actually living with my friend Chris Andrews, who's here today, and he was my roommate, and he was, you know, he knew how to edit film. I started thinking about, how do I actually recognize what and how my real life, you know, informs my project and my ideas. And I think I was just on the phone with somebody, and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm listening to Tavis Smiley and putting on shea butter." And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of it. I mean, that is like a post-Afrocentric moment, illustrated. You can't make this better, you know? So it's like, all I need to do is document it, right? And so not aestheticize it, you know, and it's a dogma film, you know, like, all the sound comes from inside. It sounds horrible. The lighting's awful. You know, but the action tells you what you need to know. You know, it's like, Tavis Smiley, for those who are unfamiliar, was the first Black man to have a show on National Public Radio. And I used to listen to him every day at 2:00. And I would just bated breath, just couldn't wait for Tavis to come on. This particular episode, he's talking about Black farmers for some reason. I don't know anything about farming. But that's what happens in the background. And so it was really just this kind of kismet moments, and making sure that I stayed kind of present and just allowed the work to follow its own path.
Yeah, and I think being able to sort of move inside, to use those materials that are about the inner life, maybe even, as you kind of alluded to, the fictional life of these characters, has been a real gift, an amazing way to kind of synthesize some of that sort of post-Afrocentric language into these objects that for me look terribly familiar. terribly familiar, but also get more ambitious in the way they can synthesize other materials like glass and mirrors, the way people can see themselves as they're looking at objects that actually may not be as familiar to them as they are to me. I'm also interested in one thing that you do, which is create works that kind of ape painting. Maybe ape's not the best word to use right now, but mimic the language of painting. They go on the wall, they're 2D, but you don't paint, right? You've never done this gestural thing of dipping a brush in pigment, adding that to a surface. You're doing pours, you're doing branding. Why do you hate painting?
That's a really good question. No one has ever asked me that. I think it's really my love of painting that drove me away from painting, to be honest. Two things. One, as we mentioned, in growing up in the 90s as an artist, the painters were not seen as the cerebral bunch, necessarily. You had folks who were working in performance, video, installation, all these new spaces, all these new opportunities, and a lot of the kind of critical thinkers were in these spaces, in photography and video, film, et cetera. And so I really saw myself more related to those folks and wanted to be kind of more in those rooms where I felt like the critical discourse was evolving and there was a spirit of newness and of transgression. And so I really thought at that time it would be a very difficult thing to approach a canvas with traditional materials. It didn't feel like it was a representation of transgression or a representation of newness in a way that I thought fulfilled my ambition. So I really found different ways to scratch that itch to some degree, which took the form of branding, took the form of the employment of signifiers and signs and repetition. Interestingly enough, we passed by a work that was a mirror shelf work called The Shuttle. And so even the stacking of books, I would often describe those as mark-making tools. I would say, oh, that's how you make a line. I want to make lines. So I would use these books as ways to make lines. I would use plants as ways to make new gestures. I would use different materials that kind of gave you different purpose or different relationship to the world. In this particular work, I was thinking a lot about reflection and mirroring. I was in conversation with a guy who I studied with named Greg Bordowitz, and he would oftentimes bring up this idea of what is nowness. And the kind of solution that I had to this was that I would make a work that you could see yourself in, and you would have this opportunity to kind of reflect on where you were at that particular moment, not unlike we do when we leave our homes in the morning. You leave your house in the morning and you fix something about your hair, or you get some schmutz off of your face, and you think that that's you for the rest of the day. Now, inevitably, something gets in your teeth, or, your hair gets folded back. You look ridiculous. I can tell you, I'm looking at you guys, you look ridiculous. But you are still kind of trapped in that last moment of having seen yourself. So that kind of idea of the now moment. So this kind of opportunity to use a reflective surface, which you see fairly consistently through the practice, is this moment of saying, let's get really, really present. And then we can see ourselves, we can kind of recognize where we are, and then we can start the process of diagnosing or imagining what it is the artist is trying to share with us, or the dialogue that the artist, in this case myself, is trying to create with us. And I think that I've always been an artist who thinks a lot about how audience functions. And although the work isn't always wholly legible, I think, and sometimes you have to do a different labor to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop, I do really, in the spirit of the work, its ambition is to be vulnerable and to share. And so I oftentimes include, quite literally, the things that I'm reading, or quite literally the materials that I use on my body. I'm really trying to be in that sense, quite generous in trying to say, no, like, it's all here. And I think that the way that we teach art oftentimes, where we create these obstacles, and people oftentimes feel like they don't have agency in interpreting it. I think that that's really unfair. We always think that there's some sort of iconography. You'll talk to kids about art and they'll say, what do you think the artist means? It's like, that you can know. No one ever asks you what you think a television show is about. People have like a real kind of vocabulary to define things that they're familiar with, like TV. Oftentimes film falls into this category, but for some reason art and the way that we imagine it's literacy creates these obstacles where people don't feel like they have the ability to understand it and define it. I really don't believe that is almost ever the case. And any artist that ever creates an obstacle for you to feeling like you can understand their work, they don't understand their work either, to be honest. They don't know what they're talking about. So never believe that shit. Because if you can't explain it to me, you do not know what you are talking about, And so that's, I think, really, really important as well.
I think that's a wonderful invitation to take you literally, which is an invitation to trust oneself, too, as we're encountering art. And I've just turned to this series that you started creating around 2015, the Anxious Man series. This is a work that's even in the show right now, because it is one where I also know that you want us to take you literally. And I do think it's quite an honest work around where you were and are affectively. What made you want to put your inner life, your innermost feelings out into the world then?
I think you get to a certain stage as an artist where you have to say, what am I saying to the folks who are paying attention to my project? And if I'm going to be really honest, I had an audience. And so when you're thinking about making work from a position of having an audience and there being kind of a natural response to what it is you do, you can reflect on that. And so I was thinking a lot about vulnerability. I started making this work when a few years after my son was born, and thinking about the responsibility of fatherhood. I also had, at that point, gotten sober, so I was kind of learning to navigate the world without the crutch of alcohol. And so I was really, that's how I felt. I was an anxious man. I was an anxious kid. I've been anxious my whole life. And so this opportunity to kind of share that vulnerability felt like it was prescient and something that I thought was important for me to say. And I felt, to be honest, that people really responded to that, and the sincerity in the gesture, and even some of the references in the gesture. And so they were made with black soap and wax. And so there was this whole kind of thing about the body and about kind of where we were collectively. Also, Trump was coming into office, or not coming into office, he was like coming down the escalator, and I was like, this is weird. I was like, this isn't gonna, no. And here we are, so I'm still anxious, but it kind of led to this body of work called Broken Men, which was about kind of the permanence of it, whereas the Anxious Men were, these materials like black soap. I felt like you could scratch them off, like that anxiety could be removed. And so these mosaics became kind of a permanent representation of that idea of kind of displacement and brokenness, and still taking into account like the collective sense.
And even set in cement, literally.
Yeah.
But you also, I think, have in your practice developed a beautiful lexicon of these sort of signs and symbols that show up throughout the work, and one that's super prominent in this exhibition, both on painting objects, but also on the stage that is on the rotunda floor, is this image called, or this symbol called the Vesica Piscis. I know it from Byzantine art. I know it as the symbol of the divine. What does it mean for you?
Yeah, I think some of that is there, and some of the kind of familiarity with how it's been employed in history, but also, I grew up watching films, but in particular, my brother's name is Shaka, and I remember being a kid and watching the film Shaka Zulu.
Oh, all the
And
time.
The shit, and my brother grew up as Shaka when Shaka Zulu had come out, so like you can imagine, and it was before our more wide embrace of kind of African, kind of diasporic kind of love. So it was a complicated thing for him, but I remember this symbol and the shields of this shape, kind of consistent, this almond shape that were in those shields. And so, quietly in the studio, I would always say, I'm making shakas, I'm making these shakas. And so that kind of started to develop. And then also, the way that it represents liminal space. Of course, it's the kind of Venn diagram moment between two overlapping circles, two really very resolved moments. And I've always thought of my approach as being quite liminal, like thinking about how one lives in the middle of something, how someone kind of unpacks their life and their experience from being kind of in the middle. I grew up in the Midwest, which is, of course, in the middle. I'm the middle child between my brother and my sister. In the middle of my life now, I think. I'm doing a mid-career survey. So this idea of middleness became so obvious to me. And so when we were kind of thinking about how and in which ways we would kind of amplify certain signifiers that I've employed previously for this exhibition, this sense of the Vesica as a middle space, I think, really started to take center stage.
And to sort of use a term that's quite commonly used now, very intersectional too, right? It's just the overlapping of things. For me, one of the most beautiful moments in the show is seeing this God painting literally inserted into and embraced by this beautiful, beautiful installation called Sanguine. Of course, sanguine is a state of mind or a state of being, but it's also a color. And so there are these, again, multiple citations and references in your work. But the installation also houses a beautiful film called Sanguine, where Here Your Father appears again in the work. And I'm wondering if you can sort of walk us a little bit through Sanguine. I'm going to move forward now. Walk us a little bit through Sanguine, because I think it's a really interesting moment as well that takes us back almost to those origins.
Yeah, Sanguine is a film that I think was a long time in the making for me, in that it starts to reflect on the moment that I'm in now, but again, on some of these ideas of liminality and middleness. But it's a film where my son and my father and myself are in space, and we're in these kind of fairly resourced spaces. And so really kind of thinking about having graduated into a certain set of opportunities. My father is cutting flowers in the garden, and I thought to myself over the course of making the film, I was like, I've never seen a black man cut flowers in a garden in a film. I've never seen, that depicted, that sense of kind of joy and opportunity and relation to nature. And so what happens in the film is that we're kind of just together, and we're kind of taking care of one another. There's a scene where we're on the beach, and this is that scene, and we're putting suntan lotion on each other's bodies. And there's two things about that. One, I never used suntan lotion until...
I thought it was shea butter when I first saw it, honestly.
No, it's suntan lotion. I didn't use it until the mid-2000s, so... But apparently, black people should really be using.
Black people should definitely use.
More
SPF,
black people die of skin cancer than any other. It's pretty intense. So let's use this as a little PSA. Yes. But this idea of kind of taking care of one another, and really, to think about kind of the opportunity that I have now to be, again, in that middle, but in a position to be a father and to be the son of a father. So someone who's still kind of learning from their father, and someone who's still looking at their father and thinking and being led by their father, but simultaneously kind of leading a young boy and being the kind of figure that they look at. And that kind of liminal space is this really beautiful moment in someone's life that that some people get to experience, and it's something that I'm experiencing now, and how that kind of turns, that eventually you oftentimes become the caretaker for your father, and your son then takes on a different responsibility and role for you. So, putting this kind of near the end of the exhibition was quite intentional, in that it is a more recent work, and it really is about something that I think is essential in my work, and that I hope a lot of you guys get to recognize through the course of the exhibition. This is not just the story of my art career. This is the story of my life. This is, the journey that I've taken. And so you see me early in stages in the work. You see certain kind of ideas being presented, whether it's like I'm photographing these men and I realize they don't think I'm any different than these men, and then graduating through these journeys of kind of opening the practice up and allowing in different materials, allowing in different signifiers, different ideas become present and prominent, and then leading all the way to, kind of finding me again, later with a child and in sobriety, and thinking about care and thinking about soul and God and love and these kind of more robust themes, and thinking, how do I allow this practice to be a vehicle that translates all of that?
It's beautiful. It's time to open up to the audience, and so I'll just point out, if anyone has any questions, there are 2 microphones toward the stage. Please speak into the microphone if you have a question for Rashid. But as people are sort of preparing themselves to come down stage to these microphones, I'll just ask one more question, which is really for you to elaborate on a phrase that I often hear you talk about, which is, you say that the purpose of your work is freedom. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, I stole it, but it really was applicable to me. But it's, I guess it's born of a conversation had between Willem de Kooning and the painter Philip Guston. And Guston, of course, many of you are aware, kind of pivoted his work at one point. He was an abstract painter, and then, of course, Guston starts making these kind of cartoonish pictures of Klansmen, and he starts, kind of leaning into a different sense of himself. And since, in the time that he did that, of course, there was a different kind of radical positioning in his project, and he was rejected by quite a few of his friends and folks who had previously championed him in his work. But Willem de Kooning came to an opening that Guston had, and he saw the paintings, and apparently he said to Philip Guston, he said, "The subject of your work is freedom." And when I heard that, I said, I'm going to steal that. And I'm going to steal it because it's really incredibly appropriate to what it is I've always wanted my work to be representative of. How do I get free? How do I say what I want to say? How do I feel the agency and the opportunity? And how do I not miss that opportunity? And so freedom is at the heart of what it is I do. And I think that, you can interpret it in all of the ways that you would.
I think we have a question here.
Okay, great. Hello, Naomi and Rashid. Congratulations, Rashid, on your show. And I just have a 2-part question. The first question is, could you just elaborate more on the plants part of your exhibit? And did you design the pots that the plants are in? And that's it.
Yeah, I did. I used to not make the potters. I used to just buy them. But I was like, I think I could figure this out. And so So now I make them. But no, plants are really interesting for me. I'm very interested in how they affect not only the institution, which is forced to kind of take care of them, right? So it's kind of like putting pressure on someone, say, okay, you guys have to figure this out, and kind of creating obstacles, which is interesting, and it's fun to watch people navigate. But also, what I kind of learned from them, I originally was kind of interested in them. I used to see old pictures of exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, and there were like plants in the galleries, and we've totally sanitized that. I mean, we've bulldozed art, and Naomi has heard me complain about the white cube of the world, and how we've made art something that, like, artists are like these children that can't be disturbed by other decorative elements or plants or anything. It's like, let's make a cube so you can make your things and be completely unmolested by the world, and then we'll all go into these white cubes and we'll look at your things because you can't in any way face any obstacles. And this infantilization is a huge problem in contemporary art. I'm serious about that. It is a huge, huge problem. But so I would look at those images, and then, I got really interested in the work of Marcel Bouters, and Bouters would use plants, and he was kind of a poet, and I was like, well, that's kind of an interesting thing. But when I started using them to kind of finish this point, the thing that was most intriguing was how empathy entered the room when the plant was in the room. And I always say, people will step over a homeless person, come into the museum, and they'll be like, who's gonna water the plants? Who is gonna take care of these plants? And however you wanna read that, when empathy enters space, it transforms space. It does something. Like, when care comes into the room, something else comes with it. And so I was obsessed with and continue to be very, very interested in the idea of kind of care being present. And even when people are getting kind of the satisfaction of the answer, care still lingers, and like maybe the rest of us can catch it when it's there.
Another question in this aisle?
Yes. My question is this. You have filled the space of the Guggenheim with such energy, and sometimes being still, I feel like I can really sense everything. But I'm also wondering, at one point you have a piece up, and you mentioned Alice Coltrane, P-Funk, and Sun Ra all together. When you work, is there any music that you really love to listen to, or do you prefer to work in silence?
No, I'm a music guy. I'm always listening to music, but I'll do different things. It's really interesting. Depends on what I'm making. If it's something new, I have to listen to music. If it's something I know how to kind of make, and I'm into the kind of meditative state of making it, I can listen to a book. And when I'm bored and I know I should stop making something, I talk to my friends on the phone. And so, like, it's how I know a body of work is over. Is that, I'll get a call and I'll be making something and I'll be like, yeah, okay, I'll see you at dinner. And I'm like, oh, I should stop this shit. I was like, I can't, I'm like now at a stage in this body of work where I'm no longer paying the level of attention I need to. But to your point, music is, for me, the thing I'm most jealous of. And musicians are the people I'm most jealous of. They're the ones who I say, God, you can like grab people by the soul. You ever listen to, John Coltrane, Love Supreme, and just think to yourself, I could cry? And then even just pivot and listen to Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue, and feel like you're in a Woody Allen movie? Sorry for anybody who doesn't like Woody. I know that can be a problem, person. But still, like, he does do really interesting depictions in New York. I'm just gonna leave that there. But yeah, I mean, music is the thing I'm most jealous of, so I'm still very much inspired by it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I also wanted to add that we opened the show with music as well, and I know that was really important for you. We brought in Kahila Zabar, the amazing percussionist, mostly, who has a group that I literally grew up listening to, the Ethnic Heritage Ensemble in Chicago, come and almost, I don't know, give a benediction to the space before we could even open the show. And so the idea, I think you're correct, that there's an energy in the space, and that was very intentional to set it with rhythm.
Hi. I have two questions. You talk a lot about time and place and where you are in life, metaphorically and also physically. But what role does location, you mentioned Woody Allen in New York, you talk about Chicago, what role does actual location play in your making? And also, how does improvisation, like jazz or planning versus a cinema, like you have to plan out a film, what role does improvisation versus planning take on in your work?
No, those are two very good questions. To take on your first question, place is essential, and I oftentimes locate you in my spaces. As an example, the film Sanguine is shot in my house. In the earliest film that you'll see in the exhibition, which is called United Boogie Down B-Boy Baptist Beat House Crew, is filmed in the Mississippi Delta. So that's about that trip. So I'm thinking a lot about, quite literally where I am, and then putting a focus on those places as I'm working. So it's essential. And improvisation, I'm really happy that you asked about it. I'm obsessed with improvisation. I'm a jazz guy, and in particular, I'm really interested in bands like Art Ensemble Chicago and some other kind of what people used to call avant-gardists. And so kind of how things fall into place is, I think, really, really important in my project as well. This is one of the reasons that I'm sometimes a very good filmmaker in my mind, and sometimes I'm a horrible filmmaker. This is why I have Alex to help produce my things, because I'm like, I'll figure it out in the edit. I'm almost too open to failure, right? And sometimes that can be a really good thing. Sometimes it's like, slow down with the failure bit. But that's because of my interest in improvisation and just thinking like, how does someone fail? Actually, interestingly enough, at the end of Sanguine, if you guys get to watch it, there's this, as Amiri Baraka is kind of doing his final poem, at the end, you hear this sound. It's like, dun, and it's really quite beautiful. What it actually is the 6th grade saxophonist band from my son's school, and they were so bad. They were so bad. I pulled out my phone, I started to record it. And I sent that recording to my editor, because I'm like, they're so bad. This is unbelievable. Like, we need to make this better. We need to find a home for this thing that allows it an opportunity to succeed. And so, like, within the space of improvisation and failure and how you can recontextualize those things and make something successful from it.
Thank you.
We'll give the last question to Warren.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Yes, I was on a curatorial tour with Naomi, and she had the concept of double consciousness and being safe within a space. Can you elaborate on that?
Could everyone hear that, by the way? He's asking about the concept of double consciousness. One of the things that appears in the show constantly is sort of two-ness, 2 figures, sometimes 3 figures, as it's now. But in specific, there is a reference to the idea of double consciousness, maybe even in some of the books in the show. So could you elaborate on that? And what was the second part? And looking for a space of safety.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so for anyone who's less aware, double consciousness is an idea that was originally brought to us through the scholar, thinker, academic, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois, in a book that he wrote called The Souls of Black Folks, describes what he considers a two-ness, or a double consciousness. And what he's describing is the idea of being both Black and and the national identity of Americanness simultaneously. So how does one square the circle of those two locations? It's something that I continue to be really quite interested in, but also recognize the limitations of. And there's another writer who's contributed to our catalog named Kevin Quashie, who really talks about the idea of kind of multiplicity. And so what you kind of see in my project is this investment not only in that sense of two-ness or an expansion on that idea of the multiple, because there are so many different defining characteristics that one can have for themselves that should really be present in that idea of kind of the self. And so whether it's kind of queer space meets gendered space meets nationality meets race meets kind of political ideology, like we all have these kind of multiple characteristics that I think become formative in the way that we see the world, and that we should in some ways celebrate. Now we have different language for it, intersectionality, right? So to some degree, that the Boysian principle is one of the kind of infant spaces to which we start to discuss the idea that we're so much more familiar with currently, which is that sense of intersectionality. And safe spaces are, I think I'm just too old to fully understand them. I think generationally, you two, we don't know, you don't know what a safe space is. You just are using those words. But you know, I subscribe. I want in because it sounds warm and it sounds wholesome. Don't know what it is, but I want one. And if anybody here has found one, just, write to museum or DM me on Instagram because I want in. But outside of that, I try to create complicated spaces.
Thank you for your honest complications.